All right. Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you today to Synchtank's Data, Rights and Royalties Summit. I'm Emma Griffiths. I'm the marketing manager at Synchtank, and I'm also the editor of our popular music industry blog, SyncBlog. And I'm going to be your host today, and I will also be participating in a couple of sessions. So we created this event to dig deeper into the key themes of our new industry report, which you can see a little preview of here. It's called Drowning in Data, and it takes a really in-depth look at the critical issues surrounding music rights, royalties, and payments in the digital age. For those of you who haven't downloaded the report yet, I'm going to now pop it into the chat so that, hang on a sec. Okay, I'm going to do that in a minute because I'm struggling to find the setting. I will put the link to the report in the chat in 2 seconds, so anyone can check that out if they haven't checked that out yet. And we have some amazing speakers today who are really at the forefront of our industry and are providing innovative solutions for improving the way we work and, most importantly, helping creators get fairly compensated for their art. So before we get started, I wanted to say a little bit about Synchtank. We are a software as a service company, and we offer solutions for managing digital entertainment assets, intellectual property, metadata, and royalties. Our solutions fall under 2 categories: our asset rights and metadata management platform, which is used by rights holders and rights owners to organize assets, manage complex rights and metadata, and exploit IP on a global scale. And then we have our royalty accounting platform, Iris, which we launched just over a year ago and is a powerful global solution that maximizes automation and unlocks real value for rights holders and administrators in the digital age. So if you'd like to learn more about Synchtank, you can drop us an email directly at the email address listed on the screen, inquiries@synchtank.com, or you can just head straight to our website and check out our solutions from there. Okay. So now a couple of housekeeping items. So for better or worse, we are running a live event today. So please do bear with us if there are going to be some glitches, which fingers crossed, but these things happen. And this also means that you will be able to ask live questions throughout the first 3 panels today. So please do remember to put your questions in the Q&A box and not the chat box. And we will try and get as many questions answered as we can. And if we don't have time, I will try and get back to you via email, and you can always email me directly at emma@synchtank.com. So if you are tweeting or posting about the summit today, please use the hashtag Synchtank Summit, and you can also follow us and tag us at Synchtank on most platforms. And do also stay tuned to our blog at syncblog.com, where you'll find some event highlights in the coming weeks. The event is being recorded, so if you miss anything or if you want to catch up on sessions later, then you can go ahead and do that at a later date. So please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat box, which I can see many people have already done, which is great. Tell us where you're from, and I'll also be dropping some relevant links to each session in the chat box too as we go. So yeah, and also it's worth noting that if you want a more interactive chat experience, you can check out our Discord server that we created for the event, and I will have the links in there as well in the chat. Okay. So here is our lineup today. We have 3 great panels for you, and then we're going to finish up with our keynote fireside conversation. We're going to try and stick to these timings, and there will also be some short breaks in between the sessions. You can also check out this schedule at synctank.com/summit. And again, I will link to that in the chat in a second. So now we are just going to wait a couple of minutes, and then we'll kick off with our first panel, which is titled Drowning in Data, How Are Systems Coping? So we'll see you in a minute. So welcome everybody to Drowning in Data, How Are Systems Coping? I am joined by an incredibly esteemed panel today with many decades of experience across royalties, data and technology. We're going to look at how royalty teams, CMOs and their systems are coping with the unprecedented data volumes and complexities of the digital age. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce you guys. So first up, we have Mick Hayes, who leads the development, launch and lifecycle management of all products and services at ICE, the world's first integrated licensing and processing hub, which is a joint venture between PRS, STIM and Gamer. Mick has worked for nearly 30 years in the music rights industry as an independent consultant, a founder of RightsCom, as an IT project manager for Capgemini, and at MCPS, PRS and ASCAP. Next up, we have Michael Lau, who has had a diverse career as a music supervisor, composer, and music publisher. Most recently serving as the COO, CTO of Roundhill Music, Michael helped to grow the company from its inception as a 3-employee fledgling indie publisher to the powerhouse that it is today, and kept the company at the forefront of technology and data. He's also the owner of 2 independent music publishing companies and was recently elected as president of the New York chapter of AIMP, the Association of Independent Music Publishers in the US. He is also a member of the operations committee of the Mechanical Licensing Collective. Next up, we are joined by Janet Landrum, who is Synchtank's royalty specialist, and she leads the development of our Iris royalty accounting platform. Janet has over 30 years experience in royalties and publishing and has particular expertise in film and television music. Prior to Synchtank, Janet spent over 2 decades at 20th Century Fox, most recently as Executive Director of Royalties, and has also held positions at Windswept Pacific and BMI. Okay, and then last but not least, we have Matt Phipps-Taylor. As Chief Information Officer at peermusic, Matt oversees the technology and data platforms used across the company's global network of music publishing and neighboring rights companies, operating from 38 offices in 31 countries. Before joining peermusic, Matt was the Chief Data Officer at UK Neighbouring Rights CMO PPL, where he oversaw data strategy, analytics and business intelligence, data architecture and governance. Matt also served on the board of DDEX and contributed to the creation of new data standards for the neighbouring rights sector. So welcome everybody, it's great to have you here.
That's good.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'm just going to kick off really quickly by sharing my screen and going through a couple of slides from our report that are particularly relevant to this panel. So first up, just to give you guys an idea of the level of data growth that we're talking about here, one leading music publisher that we spoke to for the report said that they had experienced an increased volume of data of 4,500% over the last decade. So quite substantial. And then this graph shows that there's a similar trajectory for PRS in terms of the volume of data that they had to process in the same time. And then this chart shows that based on that PRS data, we can see that the volume of data required to earn £100,000 of revenue has exploded over the last 6 years and has continued to grow. At the same time, the revenue per line of sales statement data has dropped dramatically, which highlights that significantly more data now has to be processed each year to produce the same revenue. And then lastly is our projections. So while global music publishing revenue is forecast for a 5 to 10% compound annual growth rate over the next decade, we believe that the volume of data that publishers and their systems will have to process during that time will grow at a higher rate of 20 to 30% at least per annum. So that kind of sets the scene, I think, for what we're dealing with here. I'm going to head back to you guys. So really, I wanted to start off by asking you, what has been your experience of seeing these data volumes rise, and what are the main challenges associated with this exponential growth? And I don't know who wants to kick that off, maybe Matt.
Yeah, sure. I don't know who the publisher was in your report, but I'm kind of looking at that going like only 4,500%. So yeah, I mean, it's been it's been higher than that actually for peer music over the last 10 years. The equivalent period, I think, for us, it's something like 60 times the volume of data that we were processing 10 years ago. It's really significant. And of course, some of that is, underlying, underlying business growth, more licensing, more works, inherently is going to be more data to process. But a lot of that is just driven by the nature of the market. And I think it's good to see actually on that chart, it's not good, it's challenging to see, but it's true, the acceleration in the last couple of years. We've definitely noticed that the last 2-3 years in particular, volumes are really accelerating, which is a bit scary really, because we are now talking about really substantial volumes of data.
Yeah. Anyone else want to pitch in on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I could jump in. I mean, it's just, it's not surprising, and I think it's going to get worse because more and more platforms are popping up every minute of the day. More and more rights holders are popping up every minute of the day, getting into the space. More and more sort of digital aggregators to distribute to the DSPs and other music platforms are getting into the space. So each pathway is going to have tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of lines of some sort of metadata, and that's just sort of like it's just piling on the already large pile of soup that and then on top of it, which I'm sure we'll get to, is that how does that data sort of come together and all be correct in all those different places? But yeah, but it's sending out the data, your metadata with regarding to objective metadata versus your royalty data, and then how that all stuff sort of crosses together.
Right.
I think the other thing with there to add to that challenge, not only is there more data involved in the reporting, but the licenses and scopes that organizations are operating are now wider. When it was territorial, where the processing would have been territorial, and you'd have had a local, say, especially like the CMO or local organizations, they'd be processing the data for their territory. So that same set of tracks, that same set of usage, and they'd be probably invoicing or collecting royalties for a reasonable majority of that data. But now with rights going right, they're operating licenses in 30 territories or 40 territories, they're going through the similar data 30 times because they're now going through sales in territories right across the board, but only picking out maybe small bits of those parts because of the nature of not only the volume exploding, but the rights fragmenting, which I know is a later question.
Yeah.
But I think that's another side. It's not just the amount of data, but the scope of licensing by individual organizations has broadened and caused obviously the amount of data they need to go through being a much broader set.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, and not only the length of the amount of lines you're getting have just increased exponentially, but the amount of rows as well, because there's been so much more metadata added along the lines, and being able to really beneficially report on that and pull information out of that. And like Michael said, making sure it's actually correct has gotten to the point where you're dealing with these, massive amounts of lines with all this minutia that's actually vitally important to make sure that someday it's not a line of minutia, but it's still correct and all the fragmented rights holders are getting their piece. So it's just a lot to wade through.
And then there's more metadata that's sort of having to be passed along. So an example, SysAc's, harmonized Q sheet initiative, that's a whole new set of metadata that has to be managed, for those specific situations as well.
Yeah, just keeps on coming.
Yeah.
I think it's good to celebrate though, right? I mean, it's great in a way. This is success because it does represent more different ways of licensing music. It means more transparency, to a degree in terms of the level of detail that we're now receiving as rights holders, as licensors, on the way in which our music is being used, and it's more transparency that we can pass back to our, in our case, our songwriters. So I think we should be celebrating as well. This is a fantastic
Absolutely.
thing.
Oh yeah.
But it's
not to be said that obviously you're that you're getting paid is great, and that there's too many sources trying to pay you is a great thing. And that you're getting all this information, and that actually, the information for so long, you'd get statements that would have a song title, a composer if you're lucky, and then an amount, and that would be it. And now, your wishes have come true, but maybe you have to be careful what you wish for. It's now so much that you are literally drowning in it. But it is a good at the end of the day that you're getting more information, more transparency, and all these, some tiny sources will be paying you, and it's fantastic that everybody's actually trying to do the right thing and get the money where it needs to go.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I think there's been, I think some of the growing pains of the industry has been with online, when it first started to come in as a business model, everyone tried to almost drop their existing sort of mechanical, physical product processing systems into online. And so the level of transactions that are needed to operate the licenses, that worked for low volume, high value, but it didn't start to, maybe in early download days it worked, but as you move to the streaming data models, this transactional model of lines coming in and almost being a bill, getting a bill and an invoice of line by line, that now is struggling with the business models in streaming and the prevalence of that as we move to more market share type of calculations and others. So we have to almost think of, in order to get the money and the right people paid, can we look at smarter ways where, do we need this much data? We need the quality data to match the works and the recordings, but we need to look at, are we doing enough aggregation in some of this data? Because there is a lot of duplication of what you do to the very similar pieces of data, and you're just getting it again and again and again. And that's putting general strain right across the whole value chain, I think.
I think it's also putting strains on, the rights holder systems, because, 10 years ago, maybe you're processing, medium-sized publisher, a couple of million lines of data every period. Now you could be hundreds of millions of lines. So maybe a royalty run, depending on how robust your system would be, maybe 2-3 hours, maybe 6 hours overnight. Now it could be 11 hours because it's hundreds of millions of lines of data that you're having to do. And I think, a lot of those systems are having problems keeping up.
Yeah. And that leads me really nicely onto my next question, which is, how do rights holders and CMOs, how do they keep up with this data? And how do you make sure that it's economically feasible to process this amount of data?
Well, I think the rights holders, for better or for worse, have to lean on the developers of the software that they're licensing.
Mm-hmm.
Vistex, Synchtank, Rights App, all these new platforms that are popping up, they really have to learn and kind of tweak their back end to be more agile and quick. And again, to what was said just a moment ago, is that part of the industry of how we can consolidate the data so there's less repetition, so there's less lines of data? I think it has to be approached from both sides.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be able to make it manageable so that you can report on it in a fashion that makes sense to, whoever it is that you're reporting to, whether it be finance platform, and, investors, whoever. But if you can't get that information into a format that makes sense for everybody else going up the food chain, you're going to drive yourself crazy. It's that you have to be able to aggregate it and manage it. So that's probably the biggest challenge.
Yeah, I think that point about managing it, because it's not, to a rights holder, a company having to process this stuff, it's not a pure technology problem in terms of there's a million, 100,000, 100 million, whatever it is of these things that need to have something computed on. There's a whole business process that happens, and the reality of these things is, unless everything lands on your doorstep 100% beautifully, perfectly complete, formatted, etc., it's highly unlikely that you're going to be able to completely automatically do everything. So there's always like the kind of human element in these things. So looking at it kind of holistically, this is why we're talking about drowning in data. It's not because it's a pure technology problem. The tools exist today to be able to process very large volumes of data. The fact is that there's always people involved. I mean, in our case, it's been constantly evolving the process to try and iron it out, to continue to smooth things so that we do make the most of the kind of the humans, the personnel involved in that process. I think, Emma, you just said, how does it remain economically feasible? And that's a really good point, because we talked about the increase in volume, and as you showed on your slides, that the forecast, the historical And the forecast of the value related to that volume is that they are diverging, and each row of data that we have to process is worth a fraction of what it used to be. So it's just not feasible to have, you know, people processing individual data lines. So like looking at that kind of process holistically and trying to work out how do you really minimize the need for human intervention in things, I think is really important. And that's just within one rights holder. I guess, you know, Mick's talking there about, as an industry, how do we re-engineer some of the process so that across all these companies, we can reduce the number of instances of duplication, of effort, and so on, and really streamline.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and following on from what Matt said about it's not always just a technology solution. I mean, I think there's always been in the industry some data sharing of like documentation of making sure different organizations know what the rights pictures are. But we've never as an industry looked at how do we share information that might improve processing. You know, we're all doing the same things. And I know one example, there's been an initiative of trying to get, you know, established connections between the sound recordings and the work. So the ISRC connected to the ISWC, which for the work identifier. And, you know, that's the thing that everybody's doing. They're trying to make those connections. So I think if it's going to take the strain moving forward, we've got to look as an industry of stop being competitive on some processing elements, because what we're really aiming to is making sure the rights owners get paid the royalties that they're due. That's what we all want to happen. So I think there's really got to be as an industry where we try and maybe share the load, where there is maybe more sharing of this type of information. So we're all consistent on which sound recordings, which works are linked to those sound recordings, and not repeating it, but you've got the chance of the, you know, of the trust from that. And that could start to lessen the load that you crowdsource some of this processing, and because it's a general benefit to everybody. But that does take a different mindset to what has happened, you know, what generally has been seen as some competitiveness between processing hubs in the past.
That's why it's nice to see things like SongView or BMI NASCAP are getting along and being more transparent about, you know, who's holding these different pieces of the rights, so that you can actually, you know, don't have to log into every single different one. You can get a nice overall view of, you know, where everything needs to be going and whether or not it's correct. Because, you know, coming from a film and TV background, when you've got, you know, so many cues attached to a film, you know, being able to make sure every little piece of that is correct. Because when it comes in from the foreign societies, whether you're collecting direct or collecting through a sub-publisher, making sure all of that information is correct, you know, from at least, you know, where it's coming from for us from the United States to begin with, is so important. Because the minute it goes outside of the country, it's harder to, you know, keep track of it.
Right. Yeah. And obviously, Mick, you know, with ICE, you are leading the way here, but what is your opinion, I guess the rest of the panelists, on what CMOs are doing? And in your opinion, are they doing enough?
Well, I think the forming of some common, I think we're never going to get to the situation that was attempted with the GRD, say 8 or 9 years ago, where you're not going to get everybody to join the same club or join the same group. So, but I do think that you have to move to this consolidation to some degree. So I do think what's happening now is more consolidation of services, and where we are getting more processing hubs, the idea of processing, and it's not just ICE, as other societies are joining to try and do some of their invoicing and licensing processing through joint ventures, rather than each of them building an individual system. And I think this sort of centering around hubs, that we can centralize some of the processing, and makes it much easier to then try and get consistency, because the first step is you go from 40 companies doing it to say 10 companies doing it, then maybe 5, you know, processing hubs. So I think that's an important factor, is around that approach of trying to get some consolidation in that area. But you know, the technology, changing societies and changing the technology is a hard, longer process. But by creating hubs where you can then all almost contribute together for that technology, there's more opportunity there. So I think that has been one thing of this sort of forming of hubs that the CMOs are trying to do. You know, the ones I get involved in this, and as Janet said before, you've got a lot more collaboration now with ASCAP and BMI working together to try and, you know, combine this data rather than you know, each rival to try and build their own systems, to actually join and build joint systems together make them more efficient. So I think that is sort of the direction I think that the CMOs are working towards.
Yeah. And I guess the rest of the panelists, as rights holders, what are your frustrations with CMOs? What are some of the difficulties that you've experienced?
I think the music industry is one where we depend a lot on, obviously, lots of revenue flows all over the place, and getting those correct and paying people correctly is facilitated by data flowing around as well. So we have, as an industry, we've got what I call like our data plumbing, and it's a bit notorious for being leaky. The plumbing, it would be for the English or British attendees, it's Victorian plumbing we've got. It's not great, and I think I do think CMOs generally, they have the opportunity, and I think many of them do this really well, have the opportunity to be leaders in improving that plumbing, because they have such a, they represent such a range of rights holders. They are large data managers themselves, and they can kind of exert faster improvements than we can necessarily as individual rights holders. I think it's great if rights holders generally, get involved, and definitely encourage them to. Certainly that's important to us at peermusic. Get involved in projects and initiatives, and the kind of things I'm thinking of are, as publishers, we're very interested and really pleased around CSAC's initiatives on the ISWC service, and making it possible for us as a rights holder to take responsibility for enriching, our own database with ISWC identifiers, and even requesting them and getting them signed. And we can contribute to an improved process and kind of helping that whole industry plumbing, like in our own little way. So I think I think all rights holders should try and get involved in that, and I encourage them to do so. But I do think CMOs in particular have the ability to be real leaders in that, and that's kind of what I look to them for.
Right, that's a good point. We did just get a controversial comment in the Q&A box, which was, do the professional rights organizations ever modernize? So, but the answer is yes, obviously, with ICE and processing hubs.
But I think and I agree with what everybody's saying. I just think that a lot of our data problems are just sort of legacy. And whether it's the CMO that invests in it or the rights holder, I mean, it's a joint effort and everybody has to contribute. But from the rights holder perspective, that requires manpower, that requires capacity to be able to address that. So you can do the MLSIL's DQI for 50,000 works and 30,000 are incorrect or questionable. Who's going to look at that data and who's going to sort of prune it to make sure and check with the MLC or BMI and ASCAP for Songview or whatever, or ICE or whatnot. So that's sort of, there's a capacity issue as well. And there are certain companies like Exactuals with Ray and some others that sort of do similar things that can sort of help mediate that or alleviate some of that stress to sort of narrow it down. But there is that capacity problem. Yeah. And you're right, it's not just technology.
You can't, I mean, it's hard enough for a publisher to function on a day-to-day basis, just getting everything done in and processed and calculated in a timely fashion so that you can report to your clients, but also being able to go back and start these huge projects where you're cleaning up legacy data is incredibly difficult. And that's probably the biggest problem. Your newer stuff isn't the problem. It's usually got its nice, copyright string and its ISWCs and its ISRCs, but it's the older stuff that you have to attend to, and it's really difficult.
Right. And then, for especially what's going on in today's industry the last couple of years where rights are reverting, rights are changing hands and so on and so forth. Some of those are legacy catalogs where do you stick with you just sort of take that as sort of like, okay, it's right, and then you continue to get paid wrong, or is there an opportunity to add value, to invest time in that to make sure it is correct? But then again, that's a business decision.
Yeah, and often those catalogs were created in that structure to deal with the geographical nature of the way all the royalties got collected.
Right.
They don't suit the modern world where you can actually you probably could just have far more centralized, sub-publishing a link to it, but those contracts don't go away. That still contract exists. You can't say, can you drop your contract because it's a bit difficult for us to process. So you've got some of the big high earning evergreen works which are a lot of legacy data, but they've also got incredibly complex network of agreements for internationally for you to manage that ownership of. You have, I think we were doing our translation, you had the Beatles catalogue that was also all covered by Sony, apart from EMI had it in Belgium, one song in Belgium for one work. I don't know whether that deal was done in a pub or something like this, but that's the nature of the data that you deal with, that in order to get that picture correct in every territory. When you're now bringing these hubs and doing international processing, you've got an incredibly complex picture to bring together. And with new data, as Janet said, it is a lot easier because it's cleaner and it's more, the way that we get data is a much easier to fit together. But the legacy stuff is really tricky.
And then you add that layer, what you brought up earlier, is that if someone's going to bifurcate the digital versus the terrestrial rights, and then it just adds more insult to injury.
I feel like this is a bit of a self-help group here. Yeah, definitely. And then, you've obviously got the problem at the moment with, 14, 15 songwriters on a song, which doesn't help anybody. Can you talk a little bit about how, the increased fractured nature of rights is making this challenge, all the more huge?
Well, it's not just that obviously the number of writers makes it more complicated, but because we've got the direct licensing, especially in the European market, where you've got publishers doing direct licenses where they're going to one party who's going to look after all their rights across all territories. It means who's represented, who's responsible for collecting the royalties and managing the royalties for that song is varied. And technically you could have a different owner for every one of those 17 writers. So in the past you had the issue of getting the documentation correct, so everybody got made sure the 18 writers had their correct shares in their publishers. Now we've all got to agree who's representing who invoices and manages the catalogue for each of those writers. And that's something which the industry, nothing as a sharing platform. CSAC have done things to share work data amongst everybody so that you've got some tools around there, but there's no industry tool where we agree who's controlling which rights for which publishing groups in which circumstances. There's no cross-industry tool, no common reference point anywhere can go to on that. And I think that's a major problem with the fragmentation of rights. There's no one place to get the truth from, or an agreed truth on.
I also think too, back to the earlier point, that this, as a process, if it was entirely, system and automated and everything, it would be fine, and we wouldn't really be talking about these volumes being an issue. It's the fact that there are flaws and they require intervention. And when you start getting into fragmented rights pictures and even the simple example of just many songwriters on a song, well, that means there are many registrations, and every time you add an extra one, at the beginning of the process somewhere there is a human who is typing something in somewhere, and the more people you add into that equation, the more chance there is for one little error to creep in somewhere, right? And then you've got all these different databases that's going to, and then all of a sudden something doesn't add up to 100, either something's missing or something's a little bit over, right? And the more people there are involved, the more chance there is of that going wrong and a problem arising. So there's the fragmentation in the kind of licensing and what's the truth for you, but actually just the odds of something being wrong go up exponentially every time there's another party involved in the data reconciliation process.
Well, and to that very point, again, if there's 15 writers, God help us, who's registering that same song at let's say BMI, well, there's 15, separate registrations for that. And at some point when that starts earning money, they do the dedupe processing. But what if the song title is a little bit different on three versions of that because someone put the or left the out, or, just something, and that gets missed? Now, what happens? Do 3 writers don't get paid? So there's that manual process as well. That's sort of that extra layer on top of what you're saying. And
that's the big investment, which on our side, what we're doing is along those lines of how do you manage all those different data sources, and how do you try and minimize what Michael said there, those issues of putting that jigsaw together and it's not always clean because they all have to, all we're doing is putting descriptions together. So it's like, how do you manage those various descriptions? So we've sort of, what we're looking at is the whole traceability and auditability. So every piece of information can be traced. So at least then you can, issues and problems, you go back to source of where you can get some of that data resolved from. But it is, you know, putting this bits together, as Matt said, with all these dimensions, every piece of information is right. You could get everything right, but even if you just get the publisher somewhere in the chain of linked to a writer, that could cause it to be collected by one direct licensing deal rather than another. And that just shows, you know, we've got these several layers and dimensions of data to bring together, and that's where our big investment is. And it's painful on the legacy data trying to get into that mode, and that's sort of what we're in the midst of at the moment.
I think there also needs to be an easier conflict resolution process, because that's part of the time-consuming thing as well. You can get a notification, or you can notify your CMO about that there's a conflict or whatever. That could take weeks to resolve, because everybody has to bounce around, and the PRO becomes the intermediary. Where do we all get together in collective and battle it out, you know, or discuss it nicely to get to consensus, you know, because that's part of the process too. Meanwhile, people are licensing the music, people are using the music, incomes being generated, and however long it's going to take to, and that could be just one song. Let's say it's a catalog of 5,000 songs.
Right.
And going back and getting everything fixed once you do come to a resolution, all that back, the royalties that have been collected, being able to get that corrected and paid out properly or adjusted if necessary, and get money back from different parties. It's very, very unmanageable. And again, you're talking about publishing companies that generally have one or two people that are doing this. I mean, you're lucky if you've got a whole fleet or a floor of copyright and royalties people, but generally you're talking about a couple, you know, for most of these publishers, you know, not that necessarily the big guys, but you know, human error and just lack of manpower and hours in the day.
And Janet, should I bring up the whole derivative rights issue?
No.
Because that just adds a whole nother insult to injury to this whole process, where so anyway, we could talk about that for an hour.
Right. Well, I wanted to dig into some of the questions that have come in. So Sebastian Mamie, hope I pronounced that right, says, hi, is there a figure on the cost of processing per line? The issue is not the growth of data volumes, but the growth of the processing cost per dollar distributed to rights holders.
It's a penny business.
It is a very difficult question. I mean, is one of the things we're looking to do, we're in the process of starting to re-engineer some of our licensing processes into cloud-based, and using some of these technologies like data streaming architectures. Now, they do start to allow, once you start moving onto those platforms, you can start to monitor the real costs of your processing in real terms of how long it's taking you line by line. Where it is now, we find getting that very difficult, but we are starting to trial some of this, where we are able to start seeing what's the pure cost of loading a Spotify file and what's that transaction cost all the way through. So you could still then that starts to give you figures about, when we got to that point, the economic value, what thresholds should we be processing and making sure we're processing, because you don't want to get to the stage it's costing you more to process than the royalty you're going to uncover, because all you're going to do is you're going to take those royalties of others in order to fund collecting those negative royalties. So that is the thing we are definitely, one of the focus is to try and understand that. It's difficult on some of the legacy systems to actually be able to ring fence those costs as easily as that.
Right.
Well, and it's going to be different for everybody depending on what system and what method you're using to process your statements. If you've got a good system in place that can handle the file type and the differing file types and the swath of file types across all the different sources, and you can handle that, and you're not working off of an Access database or, God help you, Excel spreadsheets, it's going to make a big difference in what the cost per line item will be for management and processing. So it's going to have a lot to do with what system each rights holder has in place to handle all of it.
And how many people need to work that
And
system?
how many people?
Because you've got to look at it holistically. I think it's a really interesting question. I think the cost per line, I would say definitely, the cost per line has gone down inevitably, because we've all got better system, better process, etc. The cost per dollar is a really, of royalty distributed, is a really interesting question, and I think that is the challenge, because the smaller the value of the lines, actually, the more the little micro overhead starts to creep in, the greater the risk of manual work being needed. So that one, I'm actually not sure whether that one has stayed flat, gone up a little bit, gone down a little bit. Really good question, Sebastian.
Yeah.
Okay, and Marty Simon says to Mick, is BMI now attached to the ICE platform?
It is. BMI. We are doing royalty processing for BMI. They're not. We're not integrated like in one copyright system with them. What we are doing their processing, where we need to do some alignment with the copyright data. So we're looking at in BMI, we're processing the royalties that aren't collected directly by major publishers on that side. So we are connected in front of a service rather than our systems are connected. So we provide a sort of almost a processing service of processing all the online data for them, and then managing and identifying their repertoire within that to then distribute to them. But it's not like an integration, say like ASCAP and BMI done, where they built a common database together for that data. But we do have obviously some data sharing, but it's not at a system level at the moment.
Okay. Orlo asks, why isn't there just one worldwide PRO?
Politics.
History.
Nobody gets along.
Right.
And
everybody's proprietary about their process.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a cultural element to PROs as well. Historically, that it was some of them very tied to the ministries of culture to them there. So they were, there's a close connectivity between that as well, which is traditionally why they're protected there.
Right.
And there are many copyright laws around the world, right? Every country has its own copyright laws, and then the interpretations of global treaties, and every country has its own language and culture and all those things which need to be met by membership teams. And I think there are a range of reasons why it'd be really difficult to come up with one global organization that service the very diverse needs of millions of creators around the world.
I think the key, Matt, is just joining the opportunities to consolidate the processing that needs to happen.
Oh, that's a different question. Yeah, why isn't there? That's back to why isn't there one global database?
Right.
Which you've already answered, Mick.
I mean, you were involved in that as well.
Right.
Politics.
Yeah.
Right. All right. Ramsey asks, isn't there room for blockchain to help in the managing of that fragmentation? Is that something that's being looked at in the industry?
I'm impressed we got this far through without anybody mentioning blockchain, actually. So well done, Ramsey, for raising that one. I think I'll give my 2 cents. I'm a bit of a blockchain skeptic personally. I think it's a very interesting technology, in the same way that technology amongst various other technologies we have available to us, a bit like I have lots of tools in my toolbox in the shed. And I think there's some really interesting things that can be done with it. I don't think so far anybody has really kind of come up with a compelling way to apply it to address any of the music type problems. The number one analogy I always hear is, oh, but isn't it a bit like financial services, where in music you're just kind of moving bits of money around between different parties, because you stream my song, you need to pay me a tiny fraction of money, can we use a blockchain, move these things around? And my answer to that has always been, in the financial services world, there's a nice kind of infrastructure setup where we have things like unique bank account numbers, and if Emma and I wish to exchange some money, we'd each have a unique account number, and we could do that, and maybe something in the middle like a blockchain could facilitate that for us. Whereas in music, the vast majority of our effort is spent going, is this the same thing as the thing that you have? I'm not quite sure. Is it my one or your one? Like, who owns this thing? Is it, we don't really have the kind of the solid backbone in a way to get to a world where like a kind of financial services type technology could be moving money around. That's for that particular application. I think there are lots of applications of blockchain, so it depends on which one you were thinking of, Ramsey, but I think not yet is my kind of view on that.
I think you nailed that, because if we go back to the legacy data issue, especially here in the States, a lot of old legacy songs don't have ISWCs, and a lot of sound recordings don't have ISRCs. So that breaks that system right there. Moving forward, that's a possibility. But yeah, I'm too, I sit on the fence, and I see there's definitely value in some sectors of it, but others, I think it's not as flexible, which it needs to be.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the
without
data
a-
is more dynamic.
Not a clean title.
I think
Sorry,
there was
without just
overlap there.
without a clean chain, it's just it won't work. I mean, just like what Matt was saying, it's if you don't have for the songs and stuff that don't have the consistent work numbers and such, it's just not going to, it's not ever going to work like that.
And added to that, just the performance of the blockchain is nowhere near that would be possible. It would not be possible with the volumes and the transactions we do. The performance of the blockchain technologies are nowhere near that at the moment for the throughput we need. So yeah, I'm with Matt. There's interesting options for it, but not in the way that this idea that you know all the metadata about a song and that's fixed, and then it's nicely protected all the way through the value chain. There's too much things change just by contracts swap and change, and then you build up this data, so it has to have lots of different updates. Some blockchains, it's not designed to be something to be really quickly edited and changed very often. It's not, it can be, but it's not its optimum.
Right. Okay, so many questions coming in. I don't know which ones to get to. Okay, Nikki Brown asks, do you think DSPs will eventually be required to consolidate data before sending over to publishers? Can there be standards eventually set up to diminish the volume a bit?
No. I mean, you're asking a huge, I mean, a lot of DSPs got into the market too without really 100% knowing what they were doing. Like, so for them to be able to pay properly is a great thing. And if they're doing it right, that's fantastic. And the more data, I think that's why they kind of throw all the data at the wall. Like, here's everything we have. It's not necessarily clean or pretty, but at least you can kind of sort through it. You're asking them all to bond together in some manner. And, you know, we can't get anybody to do that. So I can't imagine that you're going to have a single source of DSP information where they, you know, it all comes out from there. It would be very similar to us having a, you know, global copyright or anything like that. It's just, I don't see them all providing the same exact information across the board in a reasonable format.
I think, I mean, there are standards that exist at the moment for DSPs to use. I'm thinking of, we're probably wary of straying towards your next panel, Emma, but you know, there's a range of standards already available for reporting back to rights holders and processing hubs and so on. Certainly DDEX has a range which I think are pretty well utilized by DSPs. I think the point about the kind of the aggregation is a really interesting one, because is there a standard around the level of detail? As Janet says, you know, and probably as rights holders, historically everyone's pushed for more data, and actually it'd be a bit of a turnaround if we now started saying, whoa, slow down, can we have less of these? So does there need to be a sort of an evolution of standards that minimizes the amount of data? I don't know. I'm kind of torn. I like the I think I prefer the transparency and knowing what's there. I
mean, we've been looking at, I think there has to be a role to try and aggregate stuff down to the rights holders from the services. So I'm all for, as Matt, getting as much data as you want in, but if you bring that data in, then how you pass it on to your customers or the rights holders you're serving, that's where you may perform aggregation that can take the strain off them. You know, at the moment, there's a lot of pass-through. The level of data that's coming into the DSP is passed on to, I mean, from our position, is passed on to organizations like Matt's, like Peer and other publishers. So they're getting this enormous volumes of line by line data, and it's hitting them hard. And what we're looking at is there ways that you can balance that, and maybe high value transactions you pass on in a great detail, and you agree ways to aggregate or deliver data differently, like into a data analysis tool where they can, high value, they can pull and analyze the data how they want and pull it out how they want. It's just we're looking at ways to try and lessen that impact through the value chain and not pass the raw data from the DSP at that level all the way through. Because I'm with Matt, I think we want to get that data in because that's going to allow us to maximise the fairness that we can pay and distribute the royalties against. But when we deliver it, we've got to look to try and aggregate it to make it convenient for the people receiving the royalties.
So does it strangle?
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Nick.
Just that doesn't, the amount of line items you're getting now in one statement are, the amount of line items you would get for a royalty period 10 years ago. So just being able to deal with that, the more aggregation that happens, you've got to balance transparency with being able to manage that data. So like what Mick was saying, you've got to be able to aggregate it in some respects so that you're not getting the just immense volume of lines. You want the data and you want the numbers and you want all of the transparency, but at the same time, you've got to be able to get it down to a manageable level so that you can actually just process it. Because if you get all this information, but you can't do anything with it, then it's moot.
Right. But on the flip side, if you consolidate the data, you may lose the ability or the transparency to be able to solve some of the problems and identify some of the inaccuracies. So there's, where's that balance? And maybe what Mick was saying is that, if there are tools that are created to be able to sort of get what we need and then sort of go do sort of like a tail back in to sort of analyze, okay, is this stuff really correct? I don't have the answers to that. I just think is how do you balance that scale?
Right.
That's something we're looking at doing is that way almost, trying to get that balance, but giving it access, everyone can get access to the original data if they need it, but we aggregate to help them. That's the sort of a strategy that we're looking at the moment.
All right, I'm sorry guys, I have to cut everybody off now because we are out of time, but thank you so much for a great panel. The chat has definitely, and the Q&A has definitely kicked off, so it's great to see. And yeah, thank you so much for joining. And I'll ask you guys to just leave the chat if that's all right, and then we'll head on to our next panel.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Emma.
Thanks, Emma.
Thank you for having me.
Nice.